Hi, this is Kara Oakleaf, Director of Fall for the Book, a literary arts nonprofit based here at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. For information on our festival and other programs, visit fallforthebook.org. We're excited to be hosting this episode of Mason Out Loud and looking forward to talking with our guest, author Rion Amilcar Scott. Rion is the author of the short story collection, The World Doesn't Require You. His debut short story collection, Insurrections, was awarded the 2017 Penn Bingham Prize for Debut Fiction and the 2017 Hillsdale Award from the Fellowship of Southern Writers. His work has been published in journals such as the Kenyon Review, Crab Orchard Review, and The Rumpus, among others. One of his short stories was listed as a notable in Best American Stories 2018, and one of his essays was listed as a notable in Best American Essays 2015. He was raised in Silver Spring, Maryland, and earned an MFA from George Mason University, where he won the Mary Roberts Reinhardt Award, a Completion Fellowship, and an Alumni Exemplar Award. He has received fellowships from Breadloaf Writing Conference, Kimbilio, and the Colgate Writing Conference, as well as a 2019 Maryland Individual Artist Award. He teaches creative writing at the University of Maryland. Rion, thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful being here.
Yeah. So your new book, The World Doesn't Require You, is a short story collection. It's set in Cross River, Maryland, the same fictional town from your first collection. Did you always know you were going to come back to that place as a setting?
When I discovered Cross River, I fell in love with it. I knew I would always be back, and it feels like I lived there. Always, it feels like I'm far, I'm far away from home, and sitting down and writing is about coming back home. So yeah, I'm always gonna write about Cross River. Everything even if the story is not set in Cross River, it will have a connection to Cross River.
So the story behind Cross River as a town and as a setting it's a hopeful story. Cross River is a town that was founded after the country's only successful slave rebellion. So there's this very hopeful mythology behind the town, but in the collection there's kind of a lot of darkness. There's a lot of pride in the town's history, but the characters still face the same kind of racism we're very familiar with in the real world. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the mythology of that town's history, its contrast with the reality of the characters, and how the characters kind of deal with that.
Yeah, I feel like I can't escape and run away into some sort of utopia. First of all, that wouldn't make good fiction. But secondly, a lot of what I write to face the things that are really happening, and to try to put them into context, and to think about how our history is animating our movements, and in this day and age. So yeah, it's gonna touch on the darkness that's present in the world. I mean, in reality, I think in reality we have a lot of black communities that were completely destroyed by racism, like Tulsa, Oklahoma. Haiti hangs on, but I think arguably the fact that they won their slave revolt, they've been punished for historically. Actually, it's not arguably, they've been punished historically for that. So I think that the facing the darkness in Cross River is that's it's partially reality.
Yeah, and you see a lot of this other town that's nearby, Port Hugo, which is the predominantly white town that sort of stands as a contrast to Cross River in this collection.
Yep.
Yeah. A lot of the stories in this collection, you use a lot of different genres. A lot of them feel pretty grounded in realism, but then there's a lot of horror. There's a science fiction bent to some of them, and we see a lot of different elements of mythology coming in. One of the stories that stood out to me were the ones narrated by robots, where we have this really kind of dark view of the future where technology is being used to return to a time of slavery, and using these technological creations as slaves again. Can you talk a little bit about using that future technology in your work, and I guess the idea of putting all of these different genres and genre tropes into a single short story collection?
Yeah, I wanted to. I really wanted to mash up the genres and mess around with genres that I like to read, and come at it from these all genres all have their own particular history. So I'm not, I don't want to pretend like I'm reinventing it or recreating it, but using these genres to to sort of illuminate the ideas behind it, and I think yeah, I mean, like when we invent these robots, I think that there's a ethical question if they have free will. A lot of times when we invent these robots, or invent this technology, to help us to do things that we don't want to do. On this campus you got robots delivering food, right?
Yes.
Those aren't sentient robots with emotions and feeling, but if they are, the question is, treating them as servants, is that a correct thing to do? Yeah. And these are questions that I didn't make up, or I didn't come to. The science fiction has been dealing with this for as long as science fiction. Most robot stories are slave stories.
Yeah. And there is that question of where does sentience begin? I know you've mentioned the robots we have on Mason's campus. When they were first here, students were starting to decorate them with faces and things like that. And as the technology has evolved, they're able to speak to you. They'll stop and say, "Please excuse me," if they're trying to get through a crowd or something.
Well, who's to say they don't have emotions and stuff?
Well, yeah, and it's really interesting to see the way people do talk about them like they're human, and where that line gets crossed. One of the other things I noticed in this collection is there's you have a lot to say about the treatment of women and these questions of masculinity. Some of the images of women we see in this, we have one story where the women are essentially they're sirens. Another story where there's a man who's made a name for himself as an anti-rape advocate, but ends up using that position to sleep with the women who share their stories with him. The novella, of course, deals with a professor who's largely in trouble for viewing pornography on his cell phone. What was it like really tackling some of these themes, particularly at this moment in time when Me Too has become a big central feature of the culture?
For the most part, most of those stories that you mentioned were written long before the Me Too movement actually began. I wrote the A Rare and Powerful Employee in here at George Mason in Susan Shreve's class. And I think it speaks to the unfortunate durability of these issues. And I wrote that at a time when I embarrassingly didn't know that these issues that women faced. I knew women faced horrible issues of oppression and patriarchy and all that, but I didn't know the extent of it. And I'm here in my mid-20s and I'm like, wow, I didn't understand and know that. And I wrote that first story in a very angry way. So I think Numbers was written before that, but I think that story, Numbers is the one that deals with the sirens. It deals a lot with toxic masculinity, which you start to think back on your life and the how you're in fiction you're dealing in the realms of realm of emotion, as a writer, at least I have as a man, I start thinking about the ways that we're not allowed the full range of our emotion as men a lot of times, and men and boys, and the damage that causes.
Yeah, and that of course gets to what those issues with masculinity are. It's not just the treatment of women; it's the expectations put on men and boys as well. Right.
And I think the novella, I wrote that, I did write that, after the Me Too movement had begun, and we're still thinking about the boundaries of that, and and about the movement and what it means. But I think I specifically, because I'm still thinking about it and still trying to understand, everything. I think I stayed away from some some of those elements that of some of those elements that I feel like are ongoing.
So it's kind of interesting to hear that some of these stories were written way back when you were at George Mason.
Yep.
So this collection has been in the making for like maybe 10 years or
more
even
than 10 years. Some of those stories are more than 10 years old. A lot of them I couldn't figure out how to. I started them at Mason, but I couldn't figure out how to get them over the hump. If you there's some of them are the early versions, very bad versions are in my thesis in the Fenwick Library. That's still where they keep them, right?
It is, yeah.
That story that I mentioned, Rare and Powerful Employee, the one about the rape advocate. That one was actually I wrote that, and it almost came out almost as it is. I wrote it very, very quickly, and I did revision of it, but it was a lot of it was set, but I couldn't fit it into my first book. I cut it out, and so here it is now, and it fits much better into the second book than it did the first one.
Yeah. So knowing that some of these stories have been around for a while, were there other stories that you had considered putting in the first collection that didn't make it? Do you have more stories that you're kind of waiting on the next collection for?
I do. There's one story that I started at Mason, and then I wrote it, and I rewrote it, and I rewrote it, and I rewrote it. I changed it from first to third, and I was finally happy with it. I'm finally happy with it, and I was like, I can't wait for people to see it. I'd published it previously, and I wasn't satisfied with the published versions. And I was very, I was excited that people were finally going to see it, but I had to cut it for space because the novella ran so long.
Okay.
So hopefully it'll see the light of day if it can fit into the next book. So I think there are a couple. I think there might be a couple other stories in this book that couldn't fit into the first book, but more so it was that the stories were not ready, and I couldn't figure out how to get them ready, and it just took time to get better as a writer.
Yeah. And you're a teacher yourself now.
I am. I teach at University of Maryland.
Yeah. Is that something you talk about with your students a lot? I feel like it's always a little bit surprising for writing students to realize that maybe there are years and years and years behind a story.
Yeah, I haven't brought that up in class yet, but I think maybe I should. Yeah. I mean, I think that you really can't discount or throw out any stories. I have stories that I probably won't come back to, but they're of use. They're of use in the fact that I feel like since I write in such a way that everything's connected, it feels like when I have a whole story collection that didn't it was accepted at a small press and then it fell through, but it feels like those events happen. And I was working on a story the other day, and I was like, let me I could pull out that mythology, and I used the mythology that I invented back in 2011 for this new story that I'm writing right now.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So you don't throw anything out. Everything's like potentially useful.
Everything is potentially useful. Yeah.
That's good. One of the other things I wanted to ask specifically about The World Doesn't Require You is there's a lot of music in this book. We have a character who's kind of like trying to find a particular cross river sound and this river beat music. One of the story titles too has this mashup of rap and spiritual song titles, and there's even this story where we have there's a story about the temple, which is on the outskirts of Cross River, where these people are trying to emulate a particular sound. Were you thinking like consciously about making music a motif in this, or how did the music kind of come into play for a lot of these stories?
Yeah, just like music. I mean, I think music is a metaphor for the first one, finding the sound of Cross River. It's almost like a metaphor for what I'm trying to do. It's I'm trying to find this trying to find a way to clearly tell these stories. And so, it's, music's always been a big inspiration to me. It's always been something that, if I'm not, I don't listen to music when I write, but if there's a period in my life where I'm not listening to music very much, then the writing doesn't turn out well. There was a time I started getting into podcasts a lot, and I was listening to podcasts, when I'm, instead of music, and I just noticed that the writing was just so fragmented, and I had to go back and start listening to music again.
Interesting. Yeah, and there's something to the idea of having like a particular kind of rhythm in your mind, maybe when you're writing.
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah. Rhythm is incredibly important to my writing. Yeah.
So you don't listen to music while you're writing. Did you have particular songs that you associate with this book, or that you listened to a lot while you were writing it or revising it, or is everything just kind of like a mishmash?
I mean, there's a lot. I'm sure there's a lot that I've forgotten. That this one of the stories that you alluded to, "Rolling in My Six Foe." I think of it. The title is taken from the Dr. Dre chorus, who he was actually sampling Parliament Funkadelic. Parliament Funkadelic music is important to me. Funk music. The Wu-Tang Clan. There's several allusions to their music within the book. Yeah. But yeah.
Okay. We talked a little bit about your teaching, and you've been teaching for quite a while. There are some stories in the collection that kind of like poke fun at academia a little bit. We have the story about that's an understatement, I guess. Yes. We have the story about the graduate student who's writing a dissertation about that childhood game of knocking on a door and running away, and of course the novella at the end of the book is almost entirely set in an academic setting, and the narrator is almost like on this mission to take down academia. Can you talk a little bit about your experience teaching and working in universities and how that informed the writing of these stories?
Yeah, when I left Mason, I went to Bowie State University, where I stayed for 10 years, and just where I basically learned how to teach, all the rudiments of it, and I was teaching composition, and I think a lot, teaching. Academia can be a very, very frustrating place. A lot of it economically, in that it's a place that purports to be very enlightened, but the level of exploitation of work in most academic environments is off the charts. I think that if you're working as an adjunct, chances are if you don't have another job, if that's your main way to make a living, you probably don't have healthcare, you don't have job security, and you're making you're literally making your salary is literally this. You'd be better off getting a minimum wage job in many instances, and that's I don't mean that, and I'm not saying that as an exaggeration. I think obviously it's not good for society. And so, I was thinking about that a lot, and I was also thinking about the ways in which we teach, and is it effective? There's always this debate about the 5-paragraph essay, which I was teaching a lot.
Oh yeah.
And a lot of times, I think in academia, if they're packing a whole lot of students in your classes, and they're giving you 4 to 5 classes, with 20 students each. How much are each of those students getting? How much individual attention are those students getting? And these are issues that academia, it would be nice if they faced if they faced it. I think a lot of times it feels to many students as a almost like a Ponzi scheme, and if you look around in your class and there are 30 other people in there, the reason for that is money.
Yeah. Did you do the adjuncting thing for a long time?
I wasn't an adjunct.
Or-
I was
Okay, yeah.
a step up of an adjunct.
Oh, that's good,
Which
yeah.
I was a lecturer.
Okay, good, nice.
Which but it's better. But I think there are many things in there that are questionably exploitative. So
Yeah, and there are obviously real consequences for the students too. I want to ask one more question about the book as a whole, and how you went about structuring a short story collection like this. There's obviously Cross River as one of the things that unites the stories, but there are also a lot of characters that feed into each other, and characters that repeat in different stories, and a lot of the different motifs and themes come into play repeatedly, and especially in that final novella. You did mention that some of these stories, are pretty old, so it sounds like you were writing them as individual stories, and some of the connections emerged maybe as you were putting the collection together, or did you have certain things you knew you wanted to appear consistently in the collection?
I think when I initially conceived Cross River, I thought that I would be writing about this one character named Ken Sampson, and he's in my first book and he's in the second book, but he's very, he's a very crucial role, but small role in the first book, and a very, very, very small role in the second book. He minimizes himself every time I write him, and I realized at some point that Cross River is my returning character. That it is and I think about a lot of the places, a lot of the streets and the neighborhoods, the bridge. A lot of those are going to come back. And I think if a character returns, it's hard to bring back a character, because once you have a character, and you take them through a narrative action, a full narrative action, their story's done. So it really is difficult to bring back a character. I think in Insurrections there are a few characters that came back, but the second time they came back they were minor characters, and the characters that came back in, well, I'll say it like this: it has to the things that return have to come back in a way that's not contrived.
Yeah.
And there was a point where in the story of the Nigga Knockers, in that story, it takes place in, like you said, it takes place in an academic setting, and there was a certain point in the novella I was alluding to the events of the story and the character and the main character. It felt so contrived. It felt so contrived. I had to, so I got rid of that section. There was no reason for the character to return. It had no plot value. It had no character value. The only value it had was, oh wow, look at this cool thing I'm doing. So I got rid of that.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, thank you so much for spending some time talking with us today. Congratulations on all the success of the collection. It's been really exciting to see.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks. And you can find more episodes of Mason Out Loud on SoundCloud and iTunes. Thanks for listening. Read on.